You may remember at the very first lecture I mentioned how we were starting a lecture fund, an education fund in John's honor. And it started out with some very wonderful, ample gifts from members of the Galleries Board. And as of 2 days ago, the total amount of that fund has now surged to be, and here I have to find, $1,001,220. And this gift has come from a total number of 151 donors. So I want to thank all of you, as I know John does. Any of you who have not yet received the John Walsh thank you brochure and want to make a contribution, you can pick one up at the end. But this exceeded what we might have hoped. And this fund for forevermore will allow us to bring wonderful lecturers here for the kinds of work that John's been doing here for so long, and provide support of the kind of close looking we do with our education program throughout the gallery. So John, this is a wonderful tribute to what you've done to benefit this teaching museum in so many ways. And I want to announce that we've already secured the first 4 John Walsh lecturers. And first one is going to be on January 26th, and this is particularly appropriate to John's love and expertise in Dutch Golden Age art. The first John Walsh lecture is going to be Taco Dibbets, the director of the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. And he'll be giving a wonderful history on the whole sense of that great museum, some of which you've seen reference to in all of John's lectures. And then on February 2nd, one of our own great scholar curators, Larry Cantor, is sitting right here at the front row. Larry did the fabulous Fra Angelico retrospective, you might remember at the Met, before we got him here full time, and he's going to be given a lecture in search of Fra Angelico, the artist as a young man. That will be on February 2nd. Then, just very recently, we're still fixing the date and the titles. You all heard about the death of wonderful Vince Scully, who finished his 62 years of teaching in this very auditorium back in 2009. Just died. There'll be a wonderful memorial service for Vincent Patel Chapel on January 20th, and then a reception at the Art Gallery from 3 to 5:30. All of you are invited to come to that. And then in February, Paul Goldberger, one of Vince's greatest students, the former architecture critic of the New York Times and Pulitzer Prize winner and now distinguished professor at the New School in New York, will deliver a tribute lecture on Vince and his life's work. And then we've invited Ann Timpkin, one of the greatest scholars to come to Yale and study modern and contemporary art, who's now the curator of modern art and contemporary painting and sculpture at MoMA. Ann will deliver a lecture in April. So these are, in my mind, you couldn't ask for 4 more fabulous people to honor you, John, with some additional lecturing, and we're going to keep it up. So come on up here in a second. But before he does, I want to tell you 2 things. John has a kind of important birthday on Saturday. And after we go up into the lobby, we're going to have some festivities. And John was a spizwink and a wonderful member of a certain other singing group. What would that group be? The Whiffenpoofs. So John sang for both those groups. He has a great love of music. So we need to come forth with a great happy birthday song for John and toast him for all he's done for us. And again, John, I just want to thank you so much. You've done everything imaginable to support the mission artistically and educationally of this great teaching museum. John Walsh.
Amazing. Thank you. Wow. Thanks, Jock. And thank you all, donors and listeners. Today, as Jock said, we end this series with a painting that arrived at Yale when I was just finishing here. It teased me and has begged for an explanation ever since. So I'm going to ask us to do what we usually do in these lectures, which is to sit still for a few minutes and just look at it on the screen. Well, I said it teased me. It seems sort of mischievous to me. My summer vacation. Nice house, warm day, beach down there somewhere, sunlight on the wall. As I looked at more and more pictures by Hopper, questions about this one grew in my mind, along the lines of, what's wrong with this picture? It's empty, and there's the sea, but where exactly is it? And what am I supposed to think about it? Well, to start with, I'm going to ask some questions that run all through these lectures. Where does the artist ask his spectator to imagine that he or she is? What's our vantage point? And did this place that he painted look like this? And if Hopper changed it, what for? Hopper began with a real place, the front door of his house and his studio on Cape Cod, which he designed for himself and where he and his wife spent summers starting in 1934. It's lived in now, and it hasn't changed very much in 50 years since Hopper's death. Out the door, you see a deck that was added later. There's some grass and a bit of Cape Cod Bay. Here's the main room that served as a studio in the summers. The door into the bedroom is there, which became a parlor in Hopper's painting. The building sits on a bluff in Truro, high above Fisher Beach, looking west. The living room and studio have an enormous window facing north. Here you see it on the left in a photograph taken a dozen years or so after he painted the Yale picture. That summer, he was at work on a somewhat different, similar composition that we'll look at later. Behind him is his wife and helper and de facto manager, the painter Josephine Nivison, looking on. She seems a little concerned for what her husband is doing, and whether the photographer is tiring him out, and perhaps why he isn't picturing her at work painting. All hints of the complicated relationship, to put it mildly, that the Hoppers had. In the Depression years of the early 30s, life had been difficult for them financially. They lived and worked in a small fourth-floor walk-up on Washington Square. They'd been renting a place in Cape Cod for the summers, and when Joe inherited some money, they built their own house and studio. It was here, in South Truro, on the bay side of the Cape, where the red arrow points. It has 3 rooms, and it was simple, very simple. It lacked the deck on the bay outside that is there now. It had just a step down to the ground outside. Edward was happy there, and in his quiet way. Joe was alternately grumpy and witty about being locked up with Ed all summer without anybody else around. She drew a map of the area where you can see the New York, New Haven, and Hartford tracks to Provincetown right in the middle. Those were ripped up long ago, and there, facing the bay, next to a little hill called Camel's Hump, is Hopper House in a blaze of sunset. There was just one other house down the road, and there was also a pond and a marsh with nesting birds, which Joe labels swamp rookery of 1,000 squawks. And here's the house, seen from a satellite, showing you that it's quite far back from the beach, and showing you its orientation. The blue arrow points north, the exposure of that huge studio window that you saw. The house, as I said, faces west. Remember that for a few minutes, because I'll come back to it. It's owned by a couple who rent it every other summer to a painter, Philip Koch, who made some of the photographs I'll be showing you. You won't be surprised that the Hopper house, here with the arrow, has more neighbors now. There's a big house to the left on Camel's Hump. And at the right, what looks from the air like maybe a military installation, but no, it's a new house built illicitly, but now after several years of hearings and a court case has been allowed to remain. In Rooms by the Sea, the painting, Hopper was painting a corner of his own habitat, or at least beginning with it. And we can look at his drawings to see what he did with it. The first was a quick sketch of the open door in the center, and just a suggestion at the very far right of that same door open in the opposite direction, towards us. He turned the paper over, and he drew the composition in more detail. Still seeing it from the point of view of someone standing, but now showing the back room at the left and the sea out the door to the right. There's a picture on the wall, and next to it, faint lines that indicate the door swinging in. Light pours through the door opening, making shapes on the wall and the floor. And those scribbled calculations at the bottom, by the way, are for scaling up the drawing to the full size of the canvas. You might ask, well, what became of the door? He had already in mind to shift it to the other side, and so he did. The picture on the near wall, as you can see, is gone. And there are other changes as well. It's useful, actually, to look at what Hopper was looking at, the actual spot in the house, with the other things. You see at the upper left the house, and if you go clockwise to the first quick sketch, he shows a door that is window above and door below, what was actually there, the so-called Dutch door you see there now. In the painting, there at the bottom right, way over at the right edge, the door is paneled. He's eliminated the window panes. In the photograph at the house, of the house in the upper left, in the back room, you can see a window in the rear wall that Hopper barely indicated in the second drawing, and then in the painting eliminated entirely. In another photograph taken 25 years ago, you see a deck has been added, but the sea looks very much as Hopper saw it. He's changed other things, though. In the painting, he made the light slant across the wall, much the same as he did in the drawing, but he's changed the light on the floor, making its near edge parallel to the bottom and the horizon. If you look at the photograph, you notice that in the back room, you can just see a bit of the front window. And if you look at the painting now and see whether you think the light of the sun coming from above through a window of normal height, like the one you see in the picture at the left, at the top left, whether that light could fall on the wall the way it does in the painting. To figure that out, a couple of years ago, Jessica Sack and I asked a graduate student in architecture, David Burt, for some help. Architects have techniques for studying light and shade inside buildings, and he first started with a little model, and recently some computer simulations. This one shows the geometry of Hopper's painting and the patterns of light abstractly, simplified. This, though, shows how the building would have to look in order to produce the light and shade that we see in the painting. David took out the middle wall, as you see, so we can see into the back room. So the rear window would have to have been a parallelogram disappearing into the ceiling, and the front door frame would need to have a triangular extension to cast a shadow like Hopper's. So the house would have resembled the cabinet of Dr. Caligari on the Cape, and Hopper not only changed the details of his own house, the door, the furniture, the wall, the placement of windows, and so on, but he also suspended the rules of perspective. David diagrammed this for us. One-point perspective requires that parallel lines converge like railroad tracks to a point on the horizon, the vanishing point. Here they don't even try. One more point. Remember that the house faces west? Hopper's shadows are cast by light that would have come from high in the northwest. Well, the sun is never in the northwest in our hemisphere in any season or at any time of day. Hopper put the light source where he needed it to make the picture work the way he wanted it to. And I haven't even mentioned the light in the back room, cast by the bureau. That's also where Hopper wanted it, not actually where any normal source of light could possibly put it. These are all minor manipulations, though. They're part of Hopper's working methods. You'll see. The surprise here is the water outside the door. Just where are we intended to think it is? Is it just below the door, lapping at the base of the door, or far down, way down? Where is a step or a ladder for us? And why didn't Hopper make this clearer? Well, I think discrepancies like this are intentional. I think they're ways for Hopper to subvert our expectations and make us uneasy. They're expressive devices, in other words. But expressive of what? I'm going to make some suggestions about that later on. But right now, I want to look at some of the ways that Hopper, through most of his 60-year career, uses composition and light and unexpected vantage points for expressive purposes, how he makes ordinary material uncanny. The devices I'm talking about are points of view, light, cropping, the horizon, emptiness, three-part compositions, and spatial ambiguity. We're going to find Hopper using all of these in various combinations. We could start here with a familiar picture that Hopper painted a few years after Rooms by the Sea. A man sitting alone at his desk, sleeves rolled up, tilting back a bit, looking out of his window across toward a row of 19th century buildings. In the record book of Hopper's pictures, his wife Jo called it the man in concrete wall. He is confined by the cold, bare geometry of the building he's in. Hopper is implying something about the warm, old fabric and human scale of the city versus the cool featurelessness of the building that the man is in. Where could that newer building be? Hopper sets it back behind the swooping front of the much older building. So is it an addition? That close behind the facade? Or is the perspective off? And where are we spectators supposed to be? I think Hopper makes it impossible for us to know. Our uncertainty then influences how we read the situation of the man, a kind of affectless man, isolated and lost in thought. There's a bigger question for us. Why paint this subject, and why in this way? Hopper shrank from talking about his motives, but when he did, he was terse and he was consistent. He said about great artists that they have attempted to force this unwilling medium of paint and canvas into a record of their emotions. Any digressions from this large aim leads me to boredom. And why does Hopper choose some subjects over others? Well, he said, they are the best medium for a synthesis of my inner experience. So he's guided by his emotions, his inner experience. The theme of city life, life led in stacked up boxes with windows, goes back 30 years in Hopper's work. This picture is about life in close quarters, about affluence without elbow room, and without nature, which is here in the form of a forlorn potted plant in the window across the way. You may just make it out. A red-haired woman in a maid's apron is making the bed. Most of the picture is building, observed from an oblique angle, maybe two buildings superimposed, maybe just one with an air shaft with just a stripe of blue sky and a sliver of morning light that leaks in, turning the shade greenish yellow, hitting the sill and the red carpet under the wait's feet. We have no idea how high this floor is. The third? 23rd? It wouldn't matter much. And as to our vantage point, that's not clear either. Probably looking from another box out another window, maybe, and a bit higher. The perspective is correct. It's the unexpected viewpoint that's so strange, together with the banality of what we're observing. Here are some of the same visual puzzles, but more complex and applied to very different goings-on between people. Hopper creates another oblique perspective structure with two vanishing points in a room whose walls meet at irregular angles. Again, there's no line that's horizontal, parallel to the bottom of the picture. That creates instability. It makes for uneasiness. And it says something about the relationship of the boss and his secretary, as they were called back then. She's moved from her typewriter to a file cabinet, and her tight dress and her gaze towards the man are not distracting him, unless, of course, he's avoiding looking at her. We're left to imagine what, if anything, has gone on between these two communicating people. What's so effective here is the zigzag forms in the hard light at night here, the fact that, again, our vantage point is impossible. We've got an aerial view. We'd have to be standing on a chair to see what Hopper shows. The whole thing is artifice, looking like reality because he observed the details, but entirely constructed. Hopper wrote to the buyer of this painting that he'd had difficulty with the light on the wall, that faint parallelogram that connects the two figures, and is a preview of the motif that he'll be using many times over, including in the Yale painting. Few of his pictures got so much rehearsal in drawings as this one, 6 of them, and few change so much in the process. Here at the top, upper left, there's just the secretary with her back to us. Then at the top right, a man is added, reading, and a large patch of light from the window is cast on the wall. Perspective is used to construct the scene as though we were observers were standing across the room. Then, at the lower left, we're quite a lot higher. The picture has been removed from the wall, and the patch of light is smaller. In all these changes, Hopper seems to be responding to different ideas as they occur to him about what might be going on. So, in 1940, Hopper is using perspective and light and a surprising viewpoint to create a setting for an unspecified, unspoken relationship between people who don't know we're watching. Hopper made some comments on the light in the painting, and he added, "Any more than this, the picture will have to tell, but I hope it will not tell us any obvious anecdote, for none is intended." The action in the picture is mental, not physical, and it's not for us to know, but to speculate about. Well, I've taken Hopper to mid-career now and beyond in pursuit of the motifs and the devices in the Yale painting, but I haven't even introduced the artist properly, so let me do that now. Edward Hopper grew up in Nyack, New York. He, at 17, in 1899, enrolled in the New York School of Illustrating. He had a gift for portraits and caricature that developed in school and strengthened during a stay in Europe, mostly Paris, for a year starting in 1906. He came back to Paris twice in the next 3 years. He thrived on French literature, on Baudelaire and Rimbaud and Mallarmé and the symbolist poets, and Proust. These became a lifelong interest of his. Unlike John Marin and Joseph Stella, He didn't revel in the various European avant-garde movements during those years that sprang from Cézanne and Gauguin and the Nabis and the Fauves and the Cubists. He loved particularly Manet and Degas. He certainly learned from interior scenes by Degas, like the one on the left, that are emotionally charged, but for uncertain reasons and totally enigmatic. Both artists had a flair for the kind of off-center and oddly cropped composition which you can see in Hopper's street scene on the right. And in the cafe scene by Degas here at the bottom, Hopper learned from that too. When he returned to New York as an illustrator, once, 7 years after he got back, he did a big, colorful Parisian subject at the top, 6 foot wide picture at the top, recollection of his French infatuations and experiments that he didn't repeat. This is what he did do. He became an extremely good commercial illustrator. He was versatile. He did book covers in an old-timey kind of idiom like the one on the left, or illustrations for magazine fixtures and fiction in robust black and white that suggest his command of light and shade much later on, as well as his pithy way of composing figure groups to get a story across. Hopper was a success as an illustrator, and he hated it. All through the 20s, Hopper also succeeded as an etcher. But there, with no client supplying him with the subjects, he was free to pick his own, and his choices anticipate the kind of unsettling material he's soon going to be painting. A nude at a window, and a night scene composed in a way that before long is going to influence the detective movies that came to be called film noir. And he was making watercolors during summer trips to popular vacation spots. Here it's at the top, it's Gloucester. Pictures that sold very well and supported him and his new wife, Josephine. In the 1920s, Hopper was also painting in oil, as you've already seen, and I want to return to those pictures and to the etchings for a moment, looking for motifs and devices that connect to our main interest. The man in the etching here was seen from a surprise point of view, from a roof or a high window, no place specific, just way up and looking steeply down. This is a modernist device that's familiar to us, and was familiar to Hopper from photographs made by his New York contemporaries. Some of you saw the film Mannahatta that Paul Strand and Charles Sheeler made in 1920 when we talked about Joseph Stella, a film that had rooftop shots like this. Surprising viewpoints are a stock and trade for Hopper. Here, the view is sliced off by the double rail that is used to protect pedestrians as they walked over the Williamsburg Bridge. We get the upper stories of the buildings too, but not the bottom. We get the rail, but not the bridge. At first glance, it seems as careless as a snapshot. You have to supply what's missing. It's an invitation for you to imagine the neighborhood as it was before the bridge cut through it. Here's a similar device in a painting by Hopper a couple of years earlier, based on a grand house in French sort of Second Empire style in Haverstraw, New York, up the road from where he grew up. He painted it from below the New York Central Railroad tracks, which were put through long after the house was built. The house managed somehow to retain a kind of absurd, overdressed dignity despite the intrusion. Hopper saw a way to suggest the price of progress by putting us below and making the marooned house look even more forlorn. By the way, this picture was the first painting by anybody to enter the collection of the brand new Museum of Modern Art in 1930, before they had a building of their own. Hopper also plays with far distances. Here, a few years before the Yale painting, he recalled a moment when he and Joe were traveling in Charleston, South Carolina, 25 years earlier. He saw a woman standing outside who was waiting for her husband, and then when he arrived, she went quickly inside. In the drawing, he reconstructed the scene from memory. The building is at least partly commercial, evidently, since it has a prominent display window, and there's a broad sidewalk. But it's all placed out at the edge of some place that he doesn't show, and we can hardly guess at. In the painting, Hopper puts the woman on the doorstep, elegantly dressed, in a pose that's not exactly welcoming to strangers, that is, to us spectators. The grassy land stretches out beyond the sidewalk far into the distance, ending in a blue line on the horizon, which must be the sea. The right half of the picture is empty. There's some kind of sexual charge to this momentary encounter years before, and you suspect that it's been building in Hopper, perhaps in his dreams, in his inner experience, as you heard him call it. So this is not reporting, this is recollection, the kind of mental event with image attached that often motivates Hopper to paint. Another picture with a combination of enigmatic behavior and an indecipherable setting. Who are these people? They are well-dressed, they're behaving like passengers on a cruise ship, relaxing a bit stiffly as they take the sun. One man on the left reads studiously. The building is white and cubical, like the one that the office worker we saw earlier sits in. The surface they're on has no substance that we can identify and ends in what? A road? And then a field of high, dry grass, and then a distant row of hills. And it's a row, all right. It's uniform in height, running straight. How far away is it? Well, how far away is the sea in the Yale painting? We lack a scale. The picture seems to be about pleasure-seeking, slightly comic in its cast of characters, in an impossible place, an anonymous building in a locale that Hopper makes into something from a kind of futurist fantasy world that you hope you're not going to live to see. I want to come back to points of view that help determine the sense of the painting. You saw this view from a bridge, not a normal kind of scenic view, but looking over the rail to the tops of the buildings. Well, Hopper rode the elevated railways, and he looked out the train window at buildings and through them to private events inside, served up in slices framed by windows, a blowing curtain, in the middle, the backside of a woman in a pink slip, and further over, red drapery lit up by a lamp. Vignettes seen in a glance by a passenger going by, a spectator, or voyeur if you prefer. At night, the light is perfect for that, coming from inside out, the opposite of rooms by the sea. Hopper did not invent this genre. The best-known practitioner was John Sloan, a New York artist that he admired very much. Apartment house windows at night, rooftops in summer, and other places not visited by art collectors were for Sloan a source of scenes of daily life that you might never witness otherwise in New York, often involving partly undressed women in their daily routines. Hopper reconstructs quite different situations. In these glimpses. Oops. Yes. Here, a busy husband and his withdrawn wife, both well-dressed, he for the office and she perhaps for the evening, he poring over the newspaper, she turned away to the piano. She doesn't play, but she just picks at. We can't tell if their unconnectedness results from trouble or boredom or what. And where are we spectators supposed to be? presumably on the ground floor, just outside their wide-open window, and uncomfortably close to them. In the first of his etchings, as you saw, Hopper created a situation that he returns to often. A woman in a room alone, in various states of undress, is looking out a window. It can be daytime, it can be night, and often light streams in. In every case, there's something going on that's conveyed by her body language, but not her facial expression, which is either impassive or invisible. Her relation with the window and what may be outside seems important. In the painting, it's late morning. She wears shoes, but that's all. Is she waiting? Is she distracted, trying to work out a problem in her mind? We try to imagine what may be going on, or has been, or will be, some story to explain what we're seeing. We know it involves a situation inside the room and something outside, but our questions hang in the air. Remember Hopper's words of caution about his picture of an office at night. He said, "I hope it will not tell us any obvious anecdote, for none is intended." The year after he painted Rooms by the Sea, Hopper gives this motif its classic form. It's daytime, evidently early, and the implied situation is entirely different. He worked hard at getting it right. Joe was his model in this compositional study, where he'd set up an equilibrium between the window and the light projected on the wall, between the outside and the inside, with the woman in the middle as fulcrum. She's inside, but looking outside. In the painting, she wears a slip, and she sits up straighter, and the light on the wall extends out of the frame on the left, so the edge doesn't draw attention, doesn't pull our attention back, rather than forward. The day is beginning, but we don't get the feeling that she's waiting, or that some action has taken place, or will. The room is bare. The window, with its glimpse of the red brick world below, is set against the warm light that falls on her. Her expression is neutral. What the picture signifies and what it might have to do with Hopper's inner life, once again, we can only guess. We've arrived at the subject of equilibrium in Hopper's compositions, something you can recall in Rooms by the Sea, which is also a three-part composition like this, but which he uses for quite a different purpose. This famous painting has a design that does a lot of the work in generating interest in the subject. The main actor here is a uniformed usher in this movie theater. She's wearing her blonde hair in a sort of movie star do, and she stands in a classic pose of pensive absorption. She's in a little curtained, lighted foyer, separated from the darkened auditorium by a thick wall with an ornate corner. We see just two people on the left in the audience, separated by a couple of rows. And on the screen are some black and white forms that we can't decipher. So there are two contrasting zones here with a wall between. For the audience, the movie provides entertainment. For the usher, it provides a job. They see the movie, she only hears it. They're absorbed in the fantasy world of the film, she in the world of her own thoughts. We're each going to read this picture differently, but all of our reactions are bound to take account of these contrasting elements, the structure of the composition, a triad of movie, wall, and usher, of dim light, dark, and bright. Light establishes equilibrium, and sometimes it's so prominent that it's got to be charged with significance for what's going on with the people lighted up. For the woman on the bed, light may be a suggestion of reawakened consciousness and of thoughts entering the mind in the way that light enters a window and enlightens. Here the art historian in me is feeling guilty if he fails to mention the fact that light entering a room and making a pronounced pattern and stirring the spirit is a kind of image with a deep history. Hopper may or may not have realized that. Caravaggio, in the pictures on the left, a picture on the upper left, Caravaggio made light slant sharply into the room and fall on Matthew the tax collector to back up Christ's call for conversion. And below, the next generation in Rome used the motif for Peter's miraculous deliverance from prison by an angel. My teacher at Yale, John Hollander, writing about Hopper, suggested that the famous picture on the right by Adolf von Menzel, in a secular vein and closer to Hopper, painted a gentle visitation of light through curtains and on the floor to suggest another kind of spirit entering the room. In this cafeteria, light isolates the pensive young woman in a large, radiant shape. It makes a smaller shape of almost a kind of afterthought above the head of the man. There was a vaguely predatory-looking smoker across the room. It floods in on her with such abundance and such clarity, and seems to light up the whole world of life and opportunity for her, that it's a major element in how we see her and how we speculate about whatever relationship between these two might be suggested. Again, there's no story to deduce. I think it's our job to accept that the artist intended ambiguity. Hopper suggests over and over that in pictures, as in life, uncertainty is the nature of things. For 50 years, ever since his years in Paris, he'd been a great reader of French symbolist poets and an admirer of their embrace of vague thoughts, tentative emotions, elusive relations. Hopper copied out a description by Paul Valéry of Mallarmé's attempt to render the outline of a thought and to make visible expectation, doubt, and concentration. Hopper can reverse inside and outside. Here we know in a glance that it's a gas station and likely to be a mom-and-pop business. The relationship between the people is more explicit than we expect. She has an exasperated expression and says something to him from inside. He's immobile in his folding chair, not working at the pumps, where there aren't any cars anyway, and not reacting, face set, looking toward the low sun. The situation seems unusually close to home, of a kind that we can easily imagine happening between Jo, the practical organizer, easily annoyed by her husband, and Hopper, withdrawn into his own thoughts and practicing passive resistance. The year after Rooms by the Sea, Hopper painted a couple outside a beach cottage, sitting on a bench as the sun declines in the late afternoon. She relaxes, he leans forward, and they are close, but they don't make contact. Despite the pleasant associations with vacation life, the scene seems somehow desolate. There's a thin layer of clouds, and the light that we'd expect to bring warmth is instead cool. Again, the situation of the couple is ambiguous, vaguely bleak, especially contrasted with the clear, sharp, solid, man-made forms all around them. Here, the feeling of strangeness we may experience, we saw, is partly produced by those almost subliminal alterations to spatial logic, the manipulations that I pointed out earlier. But it's the emptiness of the rooms that strikes anybody first. A dozen years later, Hopper made a painting out of even less than this, just light and empty space. He worked in the house on the Cape, 81 years old then, and ailing. The picture was a struggle, he confessed. At the beginning, he'd had a figure in the room, but he soon painted it out. What's left is a window with green leaves and shadow and a bit of sky, and through the window comes sunlight that falls on the walls and the floor. That's all. Before we speculate on what this is about, let me just mention that I thought to check with our friend, the architect, the light and shade software guy, David Burt, to confirm our suspicion that Hopper once again suspended geometry to create patterns that are satisfying but impossible in real life. No surprise. When he simulated a condition where light would pass through a window of the shape that he has in the painting, the patch did not look like Hopper's. And when he simulated how the window would have to look in order for the light to fall as Hopper painted it, yeah, enough said. So it's clear that Hopper does what he pleases once again. He uses his own logic to produce a satisfying rhythm of voids and solids, lights and shades. His overall composition balances light and dark, but it reverses the usual daytime relationship of light outside, dark inside. Well, why would Hopper paint a vacant room? You think, have the people and their furniture vacated the place? Is it waiting for new people to arrive? But there's no clue of that. So what is left? Is it the pleasure of abstract design? Yeah, sure. But it's also every inch of painting, every seemingly blank surface is rich with a play of tints and varying thicknesses and small changes in design, especially the baseboard and the window. The artist's hand, in other words, is always there. A painting is literally self-conscious, too. The act of painting is front and center, as it is in Rooms by the Sea. You could think of the picture as a demonstration of and an embodiment of the visual fiction of Hopper's art. Not long after he painted the picture, Hopper told the artist and critic Brian O'Doherty that he'd been intrigued for years by the idea of painting an empty room. O'Doherty reported that when I asked a question about what he was after in light in an empty room, he was silent, and on further interrogation, responded emphatically and with some exasperation, "I'm after me." Well, all right, why would he say that? I told you earlier that Hopper's remarks about his purposes are few and brief and consistent. You heard him declare that he was guided by his emotions and his inner experience, which might have surprised you considering it comes from an artist whose work looks so objective and unemotional. Hopper kept a quotation from Johann von Goethe in his wallet that reads this way: "The beginning and the end of all artistic activity," and here Hopper added, for literary, substitute artistic. It works for that too. "The end of all artistic activity is the reproduction of the world that surrounds me by means of the world that is in me, all things being grasped, related, recreated, molded, and reconstructed in a personal form and an original manner." The world that is in me. Goethe says that he reconstructs the outer world by means of his inner world, which is what Hopper often referred to as personality. Hopper said his personality was a vast and varied realm. Hopper's work, according to O'Doherty anyway, is a search for definition of self in which he fervently believed, but of which he had imperfect knowledge. And that search to examine and define himself led Hopper to portray human situations in a way that amounts to a kind of cumulative self-portrait. That self-portrait, I would add, is a composite of a long series of pictures of various subjects that were trials, propositions, depicting invented people and places that embody Hopper's own situation, his work, his marriage, his conflicts, his doubts, his fears, his pleasures. Now, of course, it's a truism as old as Leonardo da Vinci that every artist paints himself, but Hopper made no secret of the major role that his inner life played in his artistic choices. I'm not alone in feeling that light in an empty room conveys Hopper's sense of his own isolation and the joy and perhaps consolation that the act of painting provides for him. I want to suggest that Rooms by the Sea also has this quality of testing Hopper's own choices and his situation in the world. I'll return to my suggestion, but first I want to give you some idea of how differently people have interpreted the picture. Let me start with Edward and Joe Hopper. In the record book that they kept of every painting, there are small, precise pen copies by Hopper of each work, and Hopper's list of the canvas and the paint and the varnish that he used, and his description of the painting, the details of the sale. This one, by the way, sold to Stephen Clark for $4,000, and the dealer kept a third of that as his fee. And often there are added some witty comments by Joe here. Here, after the title Rooms by the Sea, Joe added, alias the jumping off place. She added that the dealer turned that title down as having malign overtones. Others have taken the Hopper's little joke seriously. This is a paperback book, a kind of do-it-yourself guide to dying. The art historian Carter Foster and curator proposes an allegorical reading of the picture. In the catalog for his superb exhibition of the Hopper drawings at the Whitney 4 years ago, Foster says that the painting suggests an allegory of vision and looking. He writes, "The chamber and the light slanting into it from an opening evoke the mind and eye, light taken in and refracted, information relayed to and processed by the brain." Foster cites Newton and an 18th century diagram of the eye. He goes on, Hopper deepens the symbolism by rhyming the primary polygon of light in the foreroom with a similarly angled trapezoid in the rear chamber. This patch of light indexes an unseen window, the other open eye, and falls across the picture in a frame. The picture on the wall is Hopper's self-conscious acknowledgement of the role of painters as creators of windows on the world, one of the most enduring metaphors for the representation in Western art. Hopper's rooms open onto a view of the expansive ocean, visible through the doorway and a simple seascape of light and dark blue, creating a flat horizon. Here again, Hopper alludes to the painter's practice. The horizon line is fundamental for creating pictorial space on a flat surface, for rendering in painting and drawing the space we inhabit in the world and the way we perceive and understand ourselves in it. Hopper once stated emphatically that he wished to paint himself. And in Rooms by the Sea, with its multiple references to viewing, views, pictures, seeing, he seems to do just that by visually and symbolically cataloging his métier. This is ingenious and helpful in a way, and points to the seriousness of the picture. But I think it attributes to Hopper a kind of systematic attention to symbolism that would have surprised him. John Hollander, the Yale poet and critic, and lucky for me, the most influential teacher I had in college, Hollander got closest to the playfully serious spirit of Hopper's painting, using a kind of ekphrasis, an form of ancient poetry that, since antiquity, describes and partly reenacts a work of art. To do that, Hollander chose a very demanding verse form, the villanelle, 6 stanzas of 3 lines, each of them including a refrain that Hollander varies slightly as he goes. In each stanza, he tests a different impulse that might arise for somebody looking at the picture. The form suits the teasing quality of the image. The front room. To step right out of the room into the sea directly, as if the land outside had vanished with some silent boom. How wonderfully sudden it would be. How grandly liberating it could be, having swept away all but sunlight with a painter's broom, to step wide out of the room, out to the sea. To step right out of the room, onto the sea, the blue hardwood floor or its surface stretched over an almost bottomless gloom. How shockingly stabilizing it should be. How nonchalant yet stirring it might be, straw-hatted, wearing some buttonhole in yellow bloom, to step gaily out of the room, off to the sea. To step wrongly out of the room, up to the sea, as if suddenly there were nothing anymore about perspective that we could assume. How seemingly possible, yet it can't be. How simple and familiar it shall be, in the broadly ordinary, that for the time being remains our doom. To step simply out of the room, down to the sea. The late Richard Benson, photographer, teacher, dean of the School of Art at Yale, wrote about the picture and its relation to what photographers do. I love this painting because it's made of light, he wrote. One of the differences between Rooms by the Sea and a photograph is that Hopper chose everything in the picture. He was 69, so he couldn't have maneuvered a step deep enough to get out of this room. Another strange element is the sea. The size of the waves and the size of the ripples are wrong for the size of the room. Hopper has made this view of a pair of rooms as though it's through a wide-angle lens of a camera, but when he comes to the sea, it's as though he used a narrow angle that makes everything big. He's put a 19th century photograph of the sea outside of the doorway of a mid-20th century photograph of two rooms. Finally, Benson says, to make art, the photographer has to make distinctions between myriad equivalent things. But Hopper only includes what he wants. The poet Mark Strand was an expert at putting words to the experience of looking at pictures. Strand wrote this about Rooms by the Sea. A cheerful strangeness occupies its spaces. The view that fills the open doorway on the right, though stark, is not forbidding. The water seems to come up right to the door, as if there were no middle ground or shore, as if, in fact, it had been stolen from Magritte. It is a view of nature, unembellished and extreme. On the left side of a painting is a narrow, crowded view of nature's opposite, a room furnished with a couch or chair, a bureau, and a painting, the selected accoutrements of domestic life. The picture urges us to move from right to left, as if the view it wished to offer us were not of the sea, but of the partially hidden second room. Even the sea seems to be looking up and in, and the light seems to be pointing, telling us which way to look. By moving across the picture plane, we move more deeply within it. The second room is a furnished echo of the first. The doubling of the space is comforting since it enacts ideas of continuation and connection, both basic to domestic well-being, and the sea and sky, double agents of nature's will, look harmless in this context. So Strand suggests that the harmless sea and the light point us toward the domestic well-being of the second room. Well, I like his phrase, the cheerful strangeness of the spaces, but I think it's all intended to induce discomfort instead. Now, I'd like to suggest a way to think about Hopper's picture. The composition has three parts. In the center, with the wall and the floor and the patch of sunlight, the inner room at the left, and the open door with the sea. We've seen that each of these is realistic looking, but each has been manipulated so as to undercut belief, to destabilize the illusion of literal truth. Space in the sitting room is compressed, exaggerating its snugness. And as to the patch of sunlight back there and the shadow cast by the bureau, you've seen that they're impossible. On the opposite side, the sea has an absolutely regular chop, and it recedes believably, but we don't know how big the waves are or where it is. We don't know if it's just below the door or far below. There's no scale figure or point of reference to help. In the center, the bright patch that we take to be white reveals itself up close as anything but white. Instead, it's a layered mass of detached strokes of yellow, rose, blue. It's a fabricated white. So everything that we first accepted as accurate has been manipulated. What's the purpose of that? Well, I think the picture, first of all, invites us to be suspicious of appearances. Realism in painting itself is naive. I mean, why would we trust the real in the first place? Hopper meditated on these questions most of his life and used French literature as encouragement. For him, what's commonly regarded as dependable reality is actually in flux, evasive, unreliable. Appearances deceive. Humans are absent from the picture, but Hopper is here as the subject of another of his experiments, proposing his situation in life and perhaps ours. The layout of the painting asks us to think about the contrasts he's posed. In the back room, there's civility, decorum, the regular social routines of life. That room represents safety, physical comfort. It offers reassurance. It's familiar. It'll always be there. We may feel regret for what we've missed, but we will have what we have. The qualities of the sea are the opposite. We can't even know where it is for sure, how far down, how deep, and so forth, how far it extends. Sure, there may be pleasant associations with the beach and sailing, and alluring ones too, voyaging to faraway places. But there are the worrying unknowns, shoals, storms, shipwreck, never returning home, death at sea. On the left, home is where the heart is. On the right, nothing ventured, nothing gained. It's one trusty bit of folk wisdom versus another, which is, of course, a serious, enduring theme in Western literature from the Odyssey onward, and a staple of the Romantic generations of the 18th and 19th centuries, when it appears typically as a choice between stifling conformity and courageous ventures into the unknown. So in between here, what do we find? Light on the wall. That is, Hopper's painted illusion of light. You've seen that throughout his career, Hopper makes light appear in many guises, most often penetrating our closed worlds, where it seems to give life and bring thought. Light is central to both the painter's task and the spectator's. Hopper gives us spectators also a good vantage point for all this, his own. Our line of sight is a bit above the doorknob, near the horizon, not standing, in other words, but sitting where Hopper himself sat at his easel painting this. Hopper was once talking to a friend about the demands that people were making on him to give his pictures more action. Hopper said, they want me to paint people waving their arms. Then he admitted, maybe I am not very human. What I wanted to do was paint sunlight on the side of a house. Hopper's art was in choosing the fewest, simplest, most eloquent images that came to him to convey the essential realities of his own feeling, his choices, his own situation in life. And those were often ambiguous or conflicted in ways that he could never fully resolve or put to rest. Stay or go. Be silent or risk getting it wrong. Be private or public. Be stoical or vent your anger. Contemplate or paint. I see all of that in Rooms by the Sea, not only for Hopper, but in many ways for myself, and perhaps for you too. I want to say I've been grateful to all of you for being so wonderfully attentive during this series. It's been a reward for me, and I thank you very, very much. What are you doing? Oh my God. What are you doing? Thank you. Thank you.